The Street Hustler's Secret. Jordan Carter woke up to the dim, cold light filtering through the stained windows of the group shelter. The air was heavy with the sour smell of mildew, unwashed laundry, and despair. Around him, other boys were stirring, their movements sluggish under the thin blankets that barely shielded them from the winter chill. Jordan sat up, his worn hoodie his only protection against the biting cold. At 15, he was lean from hunger and sharp from necessity, his dark eyes constantly scanning for opportunity or danger. The shelter was a maze of peeling paint and forgotten dreams. It had been home for 3 years, ever since his parents died in a car crash, and the state scattered him and his older sister, Kayla, into different facilities. He hadn't seen her since that day, and the thought of her still cut like a knife. She'd been his rock, his protector. Now he was on his own. Sliding out of bed, he reached for the battered cardboard box beneath his mattress. It was his lifeline, his source of hope. Candy bars. Every morning, he hit the streets of Midtown Manhattan, weaving through the busy sidewalks and pitching his candy to indifferent strangers. It wasn't much, but it kept him fed. Barely. Jordan's stomach growled as he walked through the shelter's gloomy corridors. Breakfast was a distant memory. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the day ahead. Today, he'd make enough to save for a hot meal, maybe even for tomorrow. He tightened his hoodie against the wind as he stepped outside, the city's cacophony swallowing him whole. The subway ride to Midtown was familiar. Jordan squeezed onto the crowded train, his small frame slipping unnoticed among tired adults. His reflection in the window stared back at him. Gaunt cheeks, unkempt curls, eyes too wise for his years. But he didn't pity himself. He didn't have time for that. By the time he arrived at his usual spot, the city was alive with honking horns and hurried footsteps. Jordan set up near a busy intersection, his box of candy open and ready. The sweet smell was a brief comfort in the harshness of the streets. He moved between cars during red lights, tapping on windows, his pitch rehearsed but sincere. "Candy for a good cause," he said, his voice steady despite the sting of countless rejections. "Help a kid out today." Most people waved him off or ignored him entirely. It didn't faze him. He was used to being invisible. But then, there was the Lexus. Jordan had noticed the sleek black car weeks ago. Its driver, a middle-aged man with a neat suit and sharp features, had a presence that stood out among the hurried chaos. Every day, the man parked at the same corner and walked into the glass skyscraper across the street. He looked important, powerful, untouchable. Jordan hesitated as the Lexus pulled up. The man, Mr. Thompson, glanced at him through the tinted window before it rolled down just a crack. "Not today, kid," Thompson said, his voice polite but firm. Jordan nodded, giving a small smile before moving on. But something about the brief interaction lingered. Mr. Thompson hadn't just dismissed him. He'd looked at him, really looked at him. It was a small thing, but to Jordan, it felt significant. Most people didn't bother. The day dragged on, and Jordan's legs ached from hours of pacing the intersection. By the time he returned to the shelter, his pockets were heavy with coins, but his spirit felt lighter. He dropped onto his mattress, exhaustion pulling at him. Around him, the other boys were noisy, arguing, laughing, crying. But Jordan tuned it out, his thoughts drifting back to Mr. Thompson. He couldn't explain why, but the man had sparked something in him, a tiny ember of hope. Jordan stared at the cracked ceiling, the idea growing in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, he could ask for help. Not pity, just a chance. The shelter was a dead end. Its funding was running out, and the kids were being prepared for relocation. Jordan didn't know where he'd end up, but he knew it wouldn't be good. He needed to find a way out, a way forward. And for the first time, he felt like there was someone who might listen. As the city settled into restless sleep, Jordan lay awake, planning. He didn't have much, but he had determination. Tomorrow, he would take a risk. Tomorrow, he would speak to Mr. Thompson. A gamble on kindness, The next morning, Jordan woke before the sun, his resolve hardened despite the chill that seeped into his bones. The shelter was quieter than usual, the early hour leaving most of the boys still tangled in their threadbare blankets. Jordan moved silently, grabbing his patched-up candy box and slipping into the icy air outside. He had no appetite, not that it mattered. His usual breakfast was little more than a dream these days. He tightened his grip on the candy box, his fingers red and raw from the cold, and made his way to the subway. The familiar hum of the train was almost comforting, the sway of the car lulling him into a rhythm as he rehearsed what he was going to say. His reflection in the window caught his eye, and for a moment he saw himself the way others probably did, a scrawny kid with two big eyes and a hoodie 2 sizes too small. But he shook off the self-pity. Today wasn't about appearances. It was about survival. The streets of Midtown were already buzzing with life when Jordan arrived at his usual corner. He set up near the crosswalk, the stream of people and cars a blur around him. His eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd for a familiar figure. His heart raced every time a black car slowed near the intersection, only to drop when it wasn't the Lexus. Finally, as the clock inched closer to 9:00 a.m., the car appeared. The black Lexus pulled up to the curb, its polished exterior gleaming in the morning light. Jordan felt his stomach twist with nerves. He tightened his grip on the candy box and stepped forward. Mr. Thompson was already looking his way. The window rolled down slightly, just like before, and the man offered the same polite dismissal. "Not today, kid." But this time, Jordan didn't nod and walk away. He stood his ground, swallowing the lump in his throat. His voice came out steadier than he'd expected. "Please, sir, I need to talk to you, just for a minute." Mr. Thompson's brows furrowed, a hint of surprise crossing his features. He glanced at his watch, then back at Jordan. "What's this about?" Jordan hesitated, the words he practiced all night suddenly tangled in his mind. He took a deep breath and forced them out. "I need help. Not money, not charity. Just a chance." The man's expression softened, curiosity replacing irritation. A chance for what? Jordan's hands trembled, but he kept his gaze steady. "To get out of here. To have a life. I'm not asking for a handout. I'll work. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't do it alone." For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The honking cars, the rushing pedestrians, the biting wind, all of it faded as Mr. Thompson studied him. Finally, he sighed and pushed open the car door. "Walk with me," he said, stepping onto the sidewalk. Jordan's heart leaped. He hurried to keep pace as Mr. Thompson led him toward a nearby coffee shop. The warmth of the shop hit Jordan like a wave, and he blinked against the sudden brightness. The man ordered 2 hot chocolates without asking, then gestured for Jordan to follow him to a small table near the window. They sat in silence for a moment, the heat from the cup warming Jordan's frozen fingers. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving Jordan. "All right," he said finally. "Start from the beginning. Who are you? And what's your story?" Jordan hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. But he knew this was his chance, the moment he'd been waiting for. He told Mr. Thompson everything, starting with his parents' death and the day he and Kayla were separated. He talked about the shelter, the fights, the hopelessness that clung to the air like a fog. He told him about the candy, how he sold it to scrape by, how it was the only thing standing between him and starvation. By the time he finished, his hot chocolate was cold, untouched. Mr. Thompson hadn't said a word, his expression unreadable. Jordan's chest tightened, fear creeping in. Had he said too much? Not enough. Finally, Mr. Thompson leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You're a tough kid, Jordan. I can see that, but you're asking for a lot. You know that, right?" Jordan nodded, his throat tight. "I know, but I don't have any other options." The man sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Look, I'm not going to lie to you. Adoption isn't something you just decide to do overnight. There are laws, procedures, people who have to approve it. It's not easy. I don't care, Jordan said quickly, his voice firm. I'll do whatever it takes. I need someone to believe in me. Mr. Thompson studied him for a long moment, his expression softening. You've got guts, I'll give you that. Most people in your situation wouldn't even try to ask. He paused, glancing out the window as if weighing his next words. All right. I'll look into it. No promises, but I'll see what I can do. Jordan's heart leaped. You mean it? I mean it, Mr. Thompson said, his tone serious. But you need to understand something, kid. If I go through with this, it's not just about you. There's a system in place, and it doesn't always work in your favor. You have a sister, right? Kayla. Jordan's eyes widened. He hadn't mentioned Kayla to Mr. Thompson, but the man's expression told him he already knew. How? I made some calls, Mr. Thompson said simply. If I'm going to help you, I need to know what I'm getting into. And here's the thing. Adoption agencies don't like to separate siblings. If I take you in, it means her too. Jordan felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, hope. That's okay, he said quickly. I want her with me. She's my sister. Mr. Thompson nodded. Good. Then we're on the same page. He glanced at his watch and stood, pulling a business card from his pocket. This is going to take time, Jordan, but I'm not giving up on you. I'll be in touch. Jordan took the card with trembling hands, the weight of it grounding him. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thompson gave him a small smile. One step at a time, kid. As the man walked out of the coffee shop, Jordan sat alone, staring at the card in his hand. It wasn't a promise, but it was more than he'd had yesterday. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a chance. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting for something better. Seeds of hope. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Jordan. Every morning, he woke with a mix of excitement and dread, wondering if Mr. Thompson, Mike, as he'd asked Jordan to call him, would follow through on his word. The business card sat safely tucked under his mattress, a small but tangible reminder that someone out there cared. But the shelter's grim reality was hard to escape. The funding cuts loomed large, and the tension among the kids grew sharper by the day. Fights broke out over the smallest slights, who got the last slice of bread, who hogged the bathroom. The staff tried their best to maintain order, but their voices were tired, their eyes heavy with defeat. Everyone was on edge, and Jordan was no exception. He spent his days in Midtown as usual, clutching his candy box and scanning the streets for the sleek black Lexus. His sales were sluggish, his mind too preoccupied to focus, but he didn't care. Every time he thought about Mike's promise, his chest tightened with a strange mix of hope and fear. He wanted to believe in the man, but years of disappointment had taught him to be cautious. By the fourth day, Jordan's nerves were frayed. He'd barely eaten, his earnings just enough for a bag of chips and a soda. The shelter felt more stifling than ever, and he found himself wandering the city late into the night, trying to avoid the chaos within those crumbling walls. It was on one of these restless nights that Jordan found himself sitting on the steps of an old church, his candy box resting at his feet. The streets were quieter now, the usual bustle replaced by the occasional hum of a passing car. He stared up at the dark sky, the city lights blotting out the stars. His mind drifted to Kayla, wondering where she was, if she was okay, if she thought about him as much as he thought about her. The sound of a car door closing snapped him out of his thoughts. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat when he saw a familiar figure walking toward him. It was Mike. Dressed in a sharp gray coat and scarf, he stood out against the shabby surroundings, but his expression was warm, approachable. "Hey, kid," Mike said, stopping a few steps away. "Didn't expect to find you here." Jordan scrambled to his feet, his candy box forgotten. "Mike, what are you doing here?" Mike gestured to the street. I had some business in the area and figured I'd check in on you. You doing okay? Jordan shrugged, unsure how to answer. I guess. The shelter's a mess, though. They're talking about moving kids soon. I don't know where I'll end up. Mike's jaw tightened, and he nodded. Yeah, I heard about that. That's part of why I wanted to see you. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been talking to some people, trying to get the ball rolling. This is a list of what we'll need to move forward with the adoption process. Jordan took the paper with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the list, but the words blurred together, overwhelmed by the weight of what they represented. You mean, you're serious about this? Mike placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But you need to understand, Jordan, this is going to take time. The system doesn't move fast, and there are a lot of hurdles we'll have to clear. But I'm in this if you are. Jordan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. I'm in. Whatever it takes, I'm in. Mike smiled, a hint of relief in his eyes. Good. Because there's one more thing we need to talk about. He hesitated, glancing at the darkened street before continuing. Your sister. I've been looking into her situation, and it's complicated. She's in a shelter upstate, and from what I've heard, she's not doing well. If we go through with this, we'll need to bring her into the picture. Jordan's chest ached at the mention of Kayla. He nodded quickly, his voice firm. I want her with me. She's my sister. She's all I have. Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's what I thought you'd say. I've already made some calls to her caseworker, but it's going to take some work to get her transferred here. And even then, it's not a guarantee. I'll do whatever it takes, Jordan said, his voice shaking with determination. Just tell me what I need to do. Mike studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right. For now, just keep your head down and stay out of trouble. I'll handle the paperwork and the logistics. But I'll need you to be patient, Jordan. This isn't going to be easy. Jordan nodded, clutching the list tightly. I can do that. I promise. Mike smiled again, his hand dropping to his side. Good. Now let's get you back to the shelter. It's late, and you need to rest. The walk back was quiet but not uncomfortable. Jordan felt a strange sense of calm, as if the weight he'd been carrying for years had finally started to lighten. When they reached the shelter, Mike stopped at the gate, his expression serious. I'll be back soon, he said, and I'll bring news about your sister. In the meantime, take care of yourself, kid. You've got a lot of people rooting for you now. Jordan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thanks, Mike, for everything. As Mike walked away, Jordan watched him until he disappeared into the night. He felt a flicker of hope, small, fragile, but undeniable. For the first time in years, he believed things could change. He wasn't alone anymore. And he was ready to fight for the future he deserved. The shadows of doubt. Days turned into weeks, and the hope Jordan had felt during his last meeting with Mike began to mix with anxiety. The list Mike had given him was tucked safely under his mattress, folded and unfolded so many times that the edges were beginning to fray. He'd read it countless times, memorizing every word, every requirement, as if doing so would speed up the process. But patience was not something Jordan had ever been good at. The shelter was more chaotic than ever. The funding cuts were official, and the staff had started making arrangements to transfer several kids to other facilities. Rumors spread like wildfire through the halls. Some said the new places were worse, with overcrowding and neglect rampant. Others whispered stories about kids who disappeared entirely, lost in a system that had no room for them. Jordan tried to block out the noise, focusing instead on Mike's promise. But doubt was a persistent shadow, whispering in his ear every time the Lexus failed to appear at the corner or when the days stretched into silence. Had Mike changed his mind? Was he just another adult who made promises he couldn't keep? Jordan's worry only grew when Marcus, the oldest and most vocal of the boys at the shelter, began to target him more aggressively. Marcus had always been a bully, but now his taunts carried an edge of bitterness. "Still waiting for your rich friend to swoop in and save you, huh?" Marcus sneered one afternoon as Jordan sat on his mattress, counting his meager earnings from the day. "Hate to break it to you, but guys like that don't care about kids like us." Jordan didn't look up, his fingers tightening around the coins in his hand. "You don't know him." Marcus laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "I know his type. They throw you a bone, make you feel special for a minute, then they forget you exist. You'll see." Jordan wanted to fire back, to defend Mike, but he didn't have the energy. Deep down, he was afraid Marcus might be right. He stared at the coins in his hand, their metallic sheen dull in the dim light, and forced himself to breathe. The next day, Jordan went to Midtown as usual, his candy box under one arm and a growing sense of desperation in his chest. The streets were as busy as ever, the noise and movement a stark contrast to the stillness of his thoughts. He set up at his usual spot near the crosswalk, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the city. Jordan's legs ached from standing, and his stomach growled in protest, but he didn't move. He kept his eyes on the street, willing the black Lexus to appear. When it finally did, his heart leaped into his throat. The car pulled up to the curb, and Mike stepped out, his expression unreadable but his stride purposeful. Jordan hurried to meet him, his candy box forgotten on the ground. "Hey, kid," Mike said, his voice warm but tinged with something heavier. "Sorry it took me so long to get back. Things got complicated." Jordan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're here now. That's what matters." Mike smiled faintly, then gestured for Jordan to follow him. They walked to a nearby bench, away from the noise of the intersection, and sat down. For a moment, Mike didn't say anything, his gaze fixed on the bustling street. Then he sighed and turned to Jordan. "I've been working on this, Jordan. I've been talking to social workers, case managers, adoption agencies, anyone who might be able to help. But it's not as simple as I hoped." Jordan felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" Mike ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "Your sister, Kayla. She's in a tough spot. The shelter she's in is overcrowded, and she's been having a hard time adjusting. They're saying she's acting out, getting into fights, refusing to follow the rules." Jordan's stomach sank. "That's not her. She's not like that." "I believe you," Mike said quickly. "But that's what they're telling me. And it complicates things. If I'm going to adopt both of you, I need to prove that I can handle it, that I can provide a stable home for 2 kids, not just one. And the agencies, they're skeptical." Jordan stared at the ground, his mind racing. "What can I do? How can I help?" Mike hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is Kayla's caseworker's contact information. I want you to write her a letter. Tell her about you, about your relationship with your sister, about why you want to be with her. It might help them see things differently." Jordan took the paper, his hands trembling. "I'll do it. I'll write it tonight." Mike nodded, his expression softening. "Good. And in the meantime, I'll keep pushing on my end. But you need to be prepared, Jordan. This isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, and there's a chance it might not work out." Jordan clenched his jaw, refusing to let the fear take hold. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not giving up." Mike smiled, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I didn't think you would." That night, back at the shelter, Jordan sat on his mattress with a pen and a crumpled sheet of paper. The room was noisy, the other kids arguing and shouting, but he tuned it out. He stared at the blank page, his mind filled with memories of Kayla, her laughter, her protective hugs, the way she used to scold him for sneaking cookies before dinner. He began to write, the words pouring out of him in a messy scrawl. "Dear Miss Simmons, My name is Jordan Carter, and I'm Kayla's little brother. I'm writing because I want to tell you about her. Not the person you see on paper, but the sister I know. Kayla is the strongest person I've ever met. She's had to be. When our parents died, she didn't just lose them. She lost her whole world. But even then, she never stopped taking care of me. She made sure I ate before she did. She stayed up with me when I couldn't sleep. She gave me hope when I didn't have any. I know she's struggling right now. I know things have been hard for her, but I also know that she's not just a troublemaker or a problem. She's my sister, and she's the reason I've been able to survive everything we've been through. All I want is to be with her again, to give her the same love and support she's always given me. We're stronger together. Please, if there's anything I can do to help make that happen, tell me. I'll do whatever it takes. Thank you for listening. Jordan Carter. When he finished, Jordan read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. He felt a flicker of hope as he tucked the envelope into his candy box, but the shadow of doubt lingered. He didn't know if the letter would make a difference or if it would even reach the right person. All he knew was that he had to try. For Kayla. For himself. For the chance at a future they both deserved. A risk worth taking. Jordan clutched the envelope tightly in his hand the next morning as he made his way to Midtown. The letter was neatly folded, and though it was just a piece of paper, it felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He wasn't entirely sure how he'd get it to Kayla's caseworker, Ms. Simmons, but he trusted that Mike would help. He always had a plan, even when Jordan didn't. The streets were as bustling as ever, but Jordan's usual sales pitch lacked its usual enthusiasm. He went through the motions, holding up candy bars and calling out to passersby, but his mind was elsewhere. Every honk of a car horn, every glint of sunlight on polished metal, made him glance at the curb, hoping to see Mike's Lexus. It was late afternoon when the car finally appeared. Jordan's heart raced as Mike stepped out, his coat flapping in the chilly wind. He looked as put together as always, but there was a weariness in his eyes that Jordan hadn't noticed before. "Hey, kid," Mike said, his voice steady but soft. "Got something for me?" Jordan nodded quickly and handed him the envelope. "I wrote the letter. Everything you said to include. I hope it's enough." Mike took the envelope, his fingers brushing the edges thoughtfully. "It's a good start," he said. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people." They stood in silence for a moment, the city's noise a distant hum around them. Then Mike gestured toward the coffee shop down the block. "Let's talk inside. There's a lot we need to go over." Jordan followed him, the warmth of the shop a welcome reprieve from the biting wind. They settled into a corner booth, the same one they'd used during their first conversation. This time, Mike didn't order food or drinks. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jordan, I've been looking into Kayla's situation more closely," Mike began. "She's in a tough spot. The shelter isn't just overcrowded, it's understaffed. The caseworkers are stretched thin, and the kids aren't getting the support they need. That's why Kayla's been acting out. She's angry, scared, and trying to survive the only way she knows how." Jordan's chest tightened. He could picture Kayla, her defiant glare, her sharp words when she felt cornered. She wasn't a bad kid. She was just tired of fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. "I want to get her out of there," Mike continued. "But it's not as simple as walking in and signing some papers. The adoption process is already complicated, and adding her into the mix means we're dealing with a higher level of scrutiny. The agency is going to look at everything: my finances, my home, my ability to provide for 2 teenagers. And they're going to look at both of you, too." Jordan frowned. "What do you mean?" "They'll want to know if you and Kayla can adjust to a new environment. If you can follow rules, go to school, stay out of trouble. They'll dig into your past, your records, even your behavior at the shelter. It's not fair, but that's how the system works." Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. "So, what do we do?" Mike leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "We start by showing them what they need to see. That means staying on your best behavior at the shelter, keeping up with your responsibilities, and proving that you're ready for this. Kayla will need to do the same. Jordan nodded quickly. I can do that. And I'll talk to Kayla too. I'll write her letters if I have to. Mike smiled faintly. That's the attitude I was hoping for. But there's something else we need to discuss. Jordan tensed, bracing himself. What is it? Mike hesitated, choosing his words carefully. There's a program I've been looking into. It's for kids in tough situations, kind of like a mentorship initiative. They pair you with someone who can guide you, help you navigate the challenges you're facing. It's not adoption, but it's a step in the right direction. Jordan frowned. A mentorship? What would that mean for me and Kayla? For you, it would mean having someone else in your corner, someone who can vouch for you, teach you life skills, and help you prepare for the transition into a permanent home. For Kayla, it might mean the same thing, but we'd have to convince her to join the program first. Jordan thought about it, his mind racing. It wasn't the solution he'd been hoping for, but it sounded like a chance, a real, tangible step towards something better. Do you think it'll work? He asked quietly. Mike met his gaze, his expression firm. I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't, but it's going to take effort, Jordan. You'll need to show them that you're committed, that you're willing to do the work. Jordan straightened his shoulders, determination hardening in his chest. I'll do whatever it takes. For me and for Kayla. The mentorship program began a week later, and Jordan found himself sitting in a small, brightly lit room at a community center, surrounded by other kids from similar situations. Most of them looked skeptical, their arms crossed and their faces guarded. Jordan understood the feeling. Trust didn't come easily when life had taught you to expect disappointment. A tall man with a kind smile introduced himself as Mr. Lopez, the program coordinator. He explained how the mentorship would work: weekly meetings, one-on-one sessions with assigned mentors, and a focus on building skills like financial literacy, goal setting, and conflict resolution. It sounded daunting, but Jordan was ready to dive in. His mentor, a retired teacher named Mr. Porter, turned out to be a godsend. With his gray hair, warm eyes, and easy laugh, Mr. Porter reminded Jordan of what he imagined a grandfather might be like. He listened without judgment, offered practical advice, and never made Jordan feel small or incapable. Their first session was simple: setting short-term goals. Mr. Porter handed Jordan a blank notebook and asked him to write down 3 things he wanted to accomplish in the next month. Jordan hesitated, the pen hovering over the page. Finally, he wrote, earn enough money to buy a winter coat. Stay out of trouble at the shelter. Convince Kayla to join the program. Mr. Porter read the list and nodded approvingly. Good goals, Jordan. Achievable, but meaningful. Let's start with the first one. How do you plan to make it happen? Jordan grinned, feeling a flicker of excitement. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but building something real. As the weeks passed, Jordan threw himself into the program with everything he had. He attended every meeting, completed every assignment, and even began helping some of the younger kids of the shelter with their homework. Slowly but surely, he felt his confidence growing. But the real test came when he wrote his first letter to Kayla. It took him 3 tries to get the words right, but when he finally sealed the envelope and handed it to Mike, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. When Mike returned a week later with Kayla's response, Jordan tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Her letter was short and to the point. Classic Kayla, but it was enough to bring tears to his eyes. Jordan, I don't know if this program is for me, but I'll think about it. If you're doing it, maybe I should too. I miss you. Let's figure this out together. Kayla. It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for Jordan, that was more than enough. A risk worth taking. Jordan clutched the envelope tightly in his hand the next morning as he made his way to Midtown. The letter was neatly folded, and though it was just a piece of paper, it felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He wasn't entirely sure how he'd get it to Kayla's caseworker, Ms. Simmons, but he trusted that Mike would help. He always had a plan, even when Jordan didn't. The streets were as bustling as ever, but Jordan's usual sales pitch lacked its usual enthusiasm. He went through the motions, holding up candy bars and calling out to passersby, but his mind was elsewhere. Every honk of a car horn, every glint of sunlight on polished metal, made him glance at the curb, hoping to see Mike's Lexus. It was late afternoon when the car finally appeared. Jordan's heart raced as Mike stepped out, his coat flapping in the chilly wind. He looked as put together as always, but there was a weariness in his eyes that Jordan hadn't noticed before. "Hey, kid," Mike said, his voice steady but soft. "Got something for me?" Jordan nodded quickly and handed him the envelope. "I wrote the letter. Everything you said to include. I hope it's enough." Mike took the envelope, his fingers brushing the edges thoughtfully. "It's a good start," he said. "I'll make sure it gets to the right people." They stood in silence for a moment, the city's noise a distant hum around them. Then Mike gestured toward the coffee shop down the block. "Let's talk inside. There's a lot we need to go over." Jordan followed him, the warmth of the shop a welcome reprieve from the biting wind. They settled into a corner booth, the same one they'd used during their first conversation. This time, Mike didn't order food or drinks. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Jordan, I've been looking into Kayla's situation more closely," Mike began. "She's in a tough spot. The shelter isn't just overcrowded, it's understaffed. The caseworkers are stretched thin, and the kids aren't getting the support they need. That's why Kayla's been acting out. She's angry, scared, and trying to survive the only way she knows how." Jordan's chest tightened. He could picture Kayla, her defiant glare, her sharp words when she felt cornered. She wasn't a bad kid. She was just tired of fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight. "I want to get her out of there," Mike continued. "But it's not as simple as walking in and signing some papers. The adoption process is already complicated, and adding her into the mix means we're dealing with a higher level of scrutiny. The agency is going to look at everything: my finances, my home, my ability to provide for 2 teenagers. And they're going to look at both of you, too." Jordan frowned. "What do you mean?" "They'll want to know if you and Kayla can adjust to a new environment. If you can follow rules, go to school, stay out of trouble. They'll dig into your past, your records, even your behavior at the shelter. It's not fair, but that's how the system works." Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. "So, what do we do?" Mike leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "We start by showing them what they need to see. That means staying on your best behavior at the shelter, keeping up with your responsibilities, and proving that you're ready for this. Kayla will need to do the same." Jordan nodded quickly. "I can do that. And I'll talk to Kayla too. I'll write her letters if I have to." Mike smiled faintly. "That's the attitude I was hoping for. But there's something else we need to discuss." Jordan tensed, bracing himself. "What is it?" Mike hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "There's a program I've been looking into. It's for kids in tough situations, kind of like a mentorship initiative. They pair you with someone who can guide you, help you navigate the challenges you're facing. It's not adoption, but it's a step in the right direction." Jordan frowned. "A mentorship? What would that mean for me and Kayla?" "For you, it would mean having someone else in your corner, someone who can vouch for you, teach you life skills, and help you prepare for the transition into a permanent home. For Kayla, it might mean the same thing, but we'd have to convince her to join the program first." Jordan thought about it, his mind racing. It wasn't the solution he'd been hoping for, but it sounded like a chance, a real, tangible step toward something better. "Do you think it'll work?" he asked quietly. Mike met his gaze, his expression firm. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't. But it's going to take effort, Jordan. You'll need to show them that you're committed, that you're willing to do the work." Jordan straightened his shoulders, determination hardening in his chest. I'll do whatever it takes. For me and for Kayla. The mentorship program began a week later, and Jordan found himself sitting in a small, brightly lit room at a community center, surrounded by other kids from similar situations. Most of them looked skeptical, their arms crossed and their faces guarded. Jordan understood the feeling. Trust didn't come easily when life had taught you to expect disappointment. A tall man with a kind smile introduced himself as Mr. Lopez, the program coordinator. He explained how the mentorship would work: weekly meetings, one-on-one sessions with assigned mentors, and a focus on building skills like financial literacy, goal setting, and conflict resolution. It sounded daunting, but Jordan was ready to dive in. His mentor, a retired teacher named Mr. Porter, turned out to be a godsend. With his gray hair, warm eyes, and easy laugh, Mr. Porter reminded Jordan of what he imagined a grandfather might be like. He listened without judgment, offered practical advice, and never made Jordan feel small or incapable. Their first session was simple: setting short-term goals. Mr. Porter handed Jordan a blank notebook and asked him to write down 3 things he wanted to accomplish in the next month. Jordan hesitated, the pen hovering over the page. Finally, he wrote, "Earn enough money to buy a winter coat. Stay out of trouble at the shelter. Convince Kayla to join the program." Mr. Porter read the list and nodded approvingly. "Good goals, Jordan. Achievable, but meaningful. Let's start with the first one. How do you plan to make it happen?" Jordan grinned, feeling a flicker of excitement. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but building something real. As the weeks passed, Jordan threw himself into the program with everything he had. He attended every meeting, completed every assignment, and even began helping some of the younger kids at the shelter with their homework. Slowly but surely, he felt his confidence growing. But the real test came when he wrote his first letter to Kayla. It took him 3 tries to get the words right, but when he finally sealed the envelope and handed it to Mike, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. When Mike returned a week later with Kayla's response, Jordan tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Her letter was short and to the point, classic Kayla, but it was enough to bring tears to his eyes. "Jordan, I don't know if this program is for me, but I'll think about it. If you're doing it, maybe I should too. I miss you. Let's figure this out together. Kayla." It wasn't a promise, but it was a start. And for Jordan, that was more than enough. "You said, continue with part 6 more unique and lengthy." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 6. Reuniting Hearts. Jordan felt a surge of hope after reading Kayla's letter. Though her response was cautious, it was enough to keep him pushing forward. He shared the news with Mike during their next meeting at the coffee shop, and Mike's approving nod bolstered Jordan's resolve. "That's a good sign," Mike said, stirring his coffee. "She's willing to consider it, which is more than I expected. Now, we need to build on that momentum." "How do we do that?" Jordan asked eagerly, leaning forward in his seat. "We get her here," Mike said simply. "If she sees the progress you're making, if she understands that this program isn't just a way out, but a way forward, she might be more willing to join. I've been in touch with her caseworker, and they've agreed to let her visit for a weekend. But there's a catch." Jordan frowned. "What kind of catch?" "They'll only approve the visit if it's supervised," Mike explained. "That means you, me, and Kayla spending the weekend together. It'll be like a trial run, a chance for the agency to see how you two interact and whether this arrangement is viable." Jordan's heart raced. The idea of seeing Kayla again after all these years was both thrilling and terrifying. "When?" "Next weekend," Mike said. "I'll pick her up Friday afternoon and bring her back Sunday evening. We'll spend the weekend together, and I'll make sure the agency gets a full report." Jordan nodded, his chest tightening with anticipation. "I'll be ready." The days leading up to the visit felt like an eternity. Jordan threw himself into the mentorship program, completing every task Mr. Porter assigned him, and even going above and beyond by helping some of the younger kids of the shelter with their own goals. He wanted to prove, not just to the agency, but to himself, that he was ready for this. When Friday finally arrived, Jordan couldn't sit still. He waited outside the shelter, pacing the sidewalk as he watched for Mike's Lexus. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the street, and the chill in the air seemed sharper than usual. Finally, the car pulled up. Jordan's breath caught as the passenger door opened, and Kayla stepped out. She was taller than he remembered, her face sharper, her eyes harder. But beneath the tough exterior, she was still his sister. Kayla. Jordan ran to her, his candy box forgotten on the ground. He hesitated for a moment, unsure if she'd let him hug her, but she smiled faintly and pulled him into a tight embrace. "Hey, little brother," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "You've grown." "So have you," Jordan replied, blinking back tears. "I missed you." "Missed you too," she murmured, stepping back and looking him over. "You look good. Better than I expected." Jordan grinned sheepishly. "Thanks. You look good too." Mike stepped out of the car, his presence grounding them both. "All right, you two. Let's head inside. We've got a lot to talk about." The weekend was a whirlwind of emotions. Mike had arranged for them to stay in a modest but cozy apartment he owned in the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm, clean, and a far cry from the shelters they were used to. For Jordan, it felt like a glimpse of the future he'd been fighting for. Kayla, however, was more reserved. She spent much of the first evening sitting quietly, her arms crossed and her eyes darting around the room, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. It wasn't until Jordan pulled out the letter she'd sent him that her walls began to crack. "You kept it?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise as she held the folded paper in her hands. "Of course," Jordan said. "It's the first real connection we've had in years. I couldn't let it go." Kayla looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I missed you so much, Jordan. You don't know how hard it's been, not knowing if you were okay." "I know," Jordan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're together now. And if we keep working at this, we won't have to be apart again." The next day, Mike took them to a community center where the mentorship program was hosting a workshop. It was a chance for Kayla to see what Jordan had been doing and to meet some of the other kids in the program. Jordan was nervous, unsure how she'd react, but to his surprise, she seemed genuinely interested. During a group exercise, Mr. Porter asked everyone to share their goals for the future. When it was Jordan's turn, he stood confidently and spoke from the heart. "I want to build a life for my sister, and I don't have to worry about where we're going to sleep or what we're going to eat," he said. "I want to prove that we're worth believing in, that we can be more than what the system says we are." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Jordan thought he'd said too much. But then Kayla stood, her expression determined. "I want that too," she said, her voice steady. "For both of us." Jordan felt a swell of pride as she sat back down. For the first time, he saw a glimmer of the old Kayla, the strong, protective sister who had always fought for him. That evening, back at the apartment, Mike pulled them aside for a serious conversation. "You both did great today," he said. "But this is just the beginning. The agency is watching closely, and they'll want to see consistency. If we're going to make this work, you two need to stick together and keep showing them that you're ready for this." "We will," Jordan said quickly. "Right, Kayla?" Kayla hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm in." Mike smiled, relief evident on his face. "Good. Then let's take it one step at a time." On Sunday evening, as Mike drove Kayla back to her shelter, Jordan sat in the back seat, holding her hand tightly. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with unspoken promises and shared determination. When they arrived, Kayla turned to Jordan and gave him a fierce hug. "I'll do my part," she whispered. "But you better not give up on me." "Never," Jordan replied, his voice firm. "We're in this together." As she disappeared into the shelter, Jordan felt a pang of sadness, but it was outweighed by hope. For the first time, the future felt within reach, and he was ready to fight for it. Bridges across the divide. Jordan's hands fidgeted as he sat on the sofa in Mike's apartment after dropping Kayla back at her shelter. The evening was quiet, the city's usual hustle softened by the thick walls of the building. Mike was across the room, typing away on his laptop, but his presence offered little comfort. Jordan's thoughts were a whirlwind. Images of Kayla's weary face, memories of her guarded smile, and the echo of her whispered promise. "I'll do my part, but you better not give up on me." He hadn't told her, but he'd felt a strange fear during their weekend together. She was still his sister, still the fierce protector he remembered, but there was a hardness to her now, a shield she kept firmly in place. Jordan worried that life in her shelter had made her skeptical of people's intentions. Would she truly believe in this process? In Mike? In him? Mike's voice broke the silence. "You're quiet tonight." Jordan looked up, startled. "Just thinking." Mike closed his laptop and set it on the coffee table, leaning back in his chair. "About Kayla?" Jordan nodded. "She's different. I mean, I still see my sister in there, but it's like she's built this wall around herself. I don't know how to reach her." Mike regarded him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's not unusual, Jordan. She's been through a lot. Kids in the system learn to protect themselves, sometimes in ways that make it hard to trust others. It's not about you. It's about survival." Jordan sighed, slumping back into the cushions. "But what if she doesn't believe in this? What if she doesn't believe in me?" "She believes in you more than you think," Mike said firmly. "She wouldn't have come this weekend if she didn't. But believing in herself, that's going to take time." Jordan frowned. "How do I help her with that?" "By showing her that you're not going anywhere," Mike said. "By being consistent, patient, and willing to fight for her even when she pushes you away. She's scared, Jordan. But deep down, she wants this to work as much as you do." Over the next week, Jordan poured himself into his mentorship program, determined to make progress that would inspire Kayla. Mr. Porter noticed the change immediately. "You're on fire, kid," he said during one of their one-on-one sessions. "What's driving this sudden burst of energy?" "Kayla," Jordan admitted. "I need to show her that this program can make a difference, that we can build something better if we stick with it." Mr. Porter smiled, nodding approvingly. "You're setting an example, and that's powerful. But remember, this isn't just about convincing her. It's about preparing yourself for the future you want. Keep focusing on your goals, and the rest will follow." Jordan took the advice to heart. He attended every workshop, completed every assignment, and even started volunteering to help with community events. One Saturday, he spent hours cleaning up a local park alongside other kids from the program. As he worked, he imagined a future where he and Kayla could walk through a park like this together, free from the weight of their past. Meanwhile, Mike continued his behind-the-scenes efforts to bring the siblings together. He spent hours on the phone with caseworkers, shelter administrators, and program coordinators, navigating the complex web of bureaucracy that governed the foster care and adoption systems. It was exhausting work, but Mike's determination never wavered. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Mike called Jordan into the kitchen. He handed him a steaming mug of hot chocolate and gestured for him to sit. "I got some updates," Mike said, his tone serious but not grim. Jordan's heart raced. "What is it?" "I spoke with Kayla's caseworker again," Mike began. "They were impressed by the letter you wrote. It gave them a clearer picture of your bond with her and your commitment to staying together. They're open to the idea of transferring her to this area, but they want to see more evidence that this is the right move." Jordan frowned. "What kind of evidence?" "Consistency," Mike said. "They want to see both of you engaging with the mentorship program, maintaining good behavior, and showing that you're ready for a stable environment. They're also going to send someone to evaluate my home, and my ability to support 2 teenagers. It's a lot of hoops to jump through, but we're making progress." Jordan nodded slowly, the weight of the challenge settling over him. "So, what do I do next?" "Keep doing what you're doing," Mike said. "Focus on the program, stay out of trouble at the shelter, and keep writing to Kayla. Your letters mean more to her than you realize." Jordan felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't written to Kayla since their weekend together, afraid his words might not be enough. But Mike's encouragement reignited his determination. That night, he sat down with a blank piece of paper and began to write. "Dear Kayla, it was so good to see you last weekend. I know it wasn't easy for you to come, and I want you to know how much it meant to me. I've missed you more than I can say. I've been working hard in the program. Mr. Porter says I'm making good progress, but I don't want to do this alone. I want us to do it together. I know things haven't been easy for you, and I know you're used to handling things on your own, but you don't have to anymore. I'm here. Mike's here. We've got people in our corner now, and we can make this work if we stick together. Please think about joining the program. I think it could really help you the way it's helping me. And even if you're not ready, that's okay. I'll wait for you as long as it takes. Love, Jordan." 2 weeks later, Jordan received a response. The letter was short, but it made his heart soar. "Jordan, I've decided to give the program a shot. If you believe in it, maybe I can too. Let's do this together. Kayla." Jordan showed the letter to Mike, who smiled and gave him a pat on the back. "She's taking the first step, Jordan. That's huge. Now, let's make sure she sees this through." The day Kayla joined the mentorship program was a turning point. Though she was hesitant at first, her confidence grew with each session. She and Jordan worked together on group projects, shared their goals with Mr. Porter, and supported each other through the challenges of adjusting to a new structure. For the first time in years, they felt like a team again, a brother and sister united by more than just their past. They were building a future, one step at a time. And for Jordan, the sight of Kayla laughing during a workshop, her guard finally lowered, was worth every sacrifice he'd made to get here. A new beginning. The air in the community center buzzed with quiet anticipation as Jordan and Kayla sat side by side at a long table, their mentors nearby. It was the mentorship program's midterm evaluation day, a milestone that had both siblings feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. Mr. Porter sat across from them, his ever-reassuring smile a steadying presence. "You've come a long way," Mr. Porter said, glancing between them. "Jordan, your leadership in the program has been remarkable. And Kayla, the progress you've made in such a short time is impressive. But today's not just about the program. It's about what comes next." Jordan exchanged a glance with Kayla, who nodded subtly. She still wasn't one to express her feelings openly, but her growing confidence was clear. For the first time, Jordan felt they were truly in this together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The weeks following Kayla's enrollment in the program had been transformative. Though she approached each new challenge with guarded skepticism, Jordan saw her walls begin to crack, then slowly crumble. The Kayla he remembered, the one who used to tease him about his messy hair and sneak him extra cookies after dinner, was beginning to emerge. At first, she struggled to open up in group discussions, keeping her answers short and her gaze fixed on the floor. But as the weeks went by, she began to engage more, sharing snippets of her story and offering thoughtful insights that surprised even herself. One evening, after a particularly powerful session on resilience, she turned to Jordan and said, "Maybe this isn't as bad as I thought." Jordan grinned, sensing the cautious hope in her voice. "Told you so." Their growing bond extended beyond the program. Back at the shelter, they began writing letters to each other weekly, a habit that helped bridge the distance between their physical separation. In one of her letters, Kayla confessed how much she'd missed having him around and how scared she'd been that they'd never see each other again. The final hurdle, however, was the home evaluation. Mike had been tirelessly preparing for the visit, working with social workers and case managers to ensure everything was in order. His apartment underwent a mini transformation, with new furniture for the kids' rooms and a refrigerator stocked with more food than Jordan had ever seen. Mike also spent hours practicing answers to potential questions, determined to prove that he could provide a stable, loving home for Jordan and Kayla. The day of the evaluation arrived with a sense of tension that none of them could shake. The evaluator, Ms. Alvarez, was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard that seemed to hold the siblings' future. She spent hours touring the apartment, asking questions about Mike's financial stability, his parenting philosophy, and his plans for the siblings' education and emotional well-being. Jordan and Kayla were interviewed separately, a nerve-wracking experience for both. Ms. Alvarez asked them about their relationship, their goals, and their thoughts on living together under Mike's care. Jordan answered each question honestly, his voice steady despite the weight of their implications. When it was Kayla's turn, she hesitated before finally opening up about her struggles and her hopes for a fresh start. After what felt like an eternity, Ms. Alvarez concluded her visit with a polite but neutral smile. "Thank you for your time," she said. "I'll be submitting my report to the agency within the week." The waiting period that followed was excruciating. Mike did his best to keep them busy, organizing outings to the park, movie nights, and even a baking session that left the kitchen covered in flour and laughter. But beneath the surface, the anxiety lingered. One evening, as they sat on the apartment's balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Kayla turned to Jordan. "Do you think we'll get it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jordan didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I do. How can you be so sure?" she pressed, her eyes searching his. "Because we've come too far to stop now," he said firmly. "And because we deserve this." Kayla nodded, her expression softening. For the first time, Jordan saw a glimmer of belief in her eyes. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Mike put the phone on speaker, his hands trembling slightly as Ms. Alvarez's voice filled the room. "I'm pleased to inform you," she said, "that the agency has approved your application. Jordan and Kayla will be transferred to your care effective immediately." The room erupted into cheers. Jordan hugged Kayla tightly, his heart pounding with relief and joy. For a moment, the weight of their struggles melted away, replaced by the pure, unfiltered happiness of knowing they were finally going to be together, really together. The transition was overwhelming but exhilarating. Moving into Mike's apartment felt like stepping into a new world, one filled with possibilities they'd only dreamed of. For the first time in years, they had their own rooms, their own beds, and a sense of stability that felt almost foreign. Mike was a natural at balancing their needs, giving them the space to grow while providing the structure they craved. He encouraged Kayla to continue her work in the mentorship program, and she surprised everyone by excelling in her leadership role. Jordan, meanwhile, thrived under Mr. Porter's guidance, channeling his experiences into helping others who were still navigating the system. Months later, as the family sat around the dinner table celebrating Kayla's acceptance into a vocational training program, Jordan couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. The boy who once sold candy on the streets, clutching a battered box and a fragile hope, was now part of a family, one that had fought hard to stay together. Kayla raised her glass, a rare but genuine smile lighting up her face. "To Mike," she said, "for believing in us when no one else did." Mike chuckled, his eyes glistening. "To all of us," he said, "for proving that second chances are worth fighting for." As they clinked their glasses, Jordan felt a warmth in his chest that no cold winter night could ever touch. This was their new beginning, built on resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond of family. And it was only the beginning. Building bridges, forging futures. The sun shone brightly over the city as Jordan and Kayla stood on the balcony of Mike's apartment, sipping hot chocolate and watching the bustling streets below. It had been 6 months since they'd officially moved in, and while life wasn't perfect, it was better than either of them could have imagined. Jordan had grown into his role as a mentor in training at the community center, spending his afternoons guiding younger kids who reminded him of his past self, wide-eyed, unsure, and desperate for direction. Kayla, meanwhile, had embraced her vocational program with a determination that impressed everyone around her. She was excelling in her culinary training, often bringing home dishes that transformed their kitchen into a feast of new flavors. "Remember when we thought this would never happen?" Kayla said, breaking the comfortable silence. She turned to Jordan, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Feels like a lifetime ago." Jordan nodded, his gaze fixed on the skyline. "Yeah, but we made it. Together." Kayla's smile widened, and for the first time, Jordan saw her not as the guarded, battle-worn girl she had become, but as the sister he'd always admired, the one who used to tuck him in at night and promised that everything would be okay. The transformation hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of their past threatened to pull them back into old habits, when Kayla's temper flared or Jordan's insecurities crept in. But Mike's unwavering support and the structure he provided had given them the tools to face those challenges head-on. One evening, as they sat in the living room reviewing Kayla's latest recipe project, Mike leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, you two are the strongest people I've ever met." Kayla looked up from her notebook, raising an eyebrow. "Us? Strong? You're the one who put up with all our drama." Mike chuckled. "That's the easy part. The hard part is what you've done. Choosing to trust, to hope, to work toward a future when it would have been easier to give up." Jordan exchanged a glance with Kayla, who shrugged but didn't argue. For once, she seemed willing to accept the compliment. The mentorship program had become a cornerstone of their lives. Kayla, initially skeptical, had taken to mentoring younger girls in the program, many of whom reminded her of herself. She taught them not just how to navigate their challenges, but how to see their own worth. One day, during a community event, Jordan overheard one of Kayla's mentees say, "Miss Kayla makes me feel like I can do anything." The pride that swelled in his chest was indescribable. Meanwhile, Jordan's work with Mr. Porter continued to thrive. He'd recently started leading workshops on goal setting and resilience, sharing his own story as a way to inspire others. His honesty and vulnerability resonated deeply with the kids, many of whom began looking up to him as a role model. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if Mike hadn't stopped that day?" Jordan asked one evening as they walked home from the community center. Kayla thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't want to. What matters is where we are now." Their bond with Mike had grown into something they'd never expected. He wasn't just their guardian, he was their family. He attended every milestone. Kayla's first culinary showcase, Jordan's first public speaking event at the mentorship program, and cheered louder than anyone in the room. One night, as they sat around the dinner table, Mike brought out a small stack of papers. "What's that?" Kayla asked, eyeing the documents warily. Mike smiled, sliding the papers toward them. "Adoption papers." The room went silent. "I've been thinking about this for a while," Mike continued. "You're already family in every way that matters, but I'd like to make it official. Only if you're okay with it." Kayla's eyes widened, and Jordan felt his throat tighten. For a moment, neither of them could speak. Then Kayla, ever the skeptical one, broke the silence. "Why would you want to do that?" she asked, her voice tinged with vulnerability. Mike's expression softened. "Because you're my kids. I didn't just open my home to you. I opened my heart. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be the dad you deserve." Jordan's vision blurred as tears welled in his eyes. He looked at Kayla, whose tough exterior seemed to crumble in that moment. She nodded slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." The adoption process was lengthy and complicated, but for once, Jordan and Kayla felt like the system was working in their favor. With Mike's persistence and the glowing recommendations from the mentorship program and their caseworkers, the final approval came faster than expected. The day of the court hearing, the three of them dressed in their best clothes, and walked into the courthouse together. Jordan couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nervousness, but when the judge officially declared them a family, his heart soared. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Kayla turned to Mike and said, "So, does this mean we have to start calling you Dad now?" Mike laughed, wrapping an arm around each of them. "You can call me whatever you want, as long as you know I'm here for you. Always." Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The labels didn't matter as much as the love they shared. Kayla continued to excel in her culinary program, dreaming of one day opening a bakery. Jordan, inspired by his own journey, began working toward a career in social work, determined to help other kids who felt as lost as he once had. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Kayla brought out a cake she'd baked, a decadent chocolate creation decorated with the words "to family" in elegant icing. "To family," Jordan echoed, raising his glass of milk. Mike smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "To the future." As they dug into the cake, laughter and love filled the room, a testament to how far they'd come and the unshakable bond they'd built. They weren't just survivors. They were a family. And together, they knew they could face anything.